Well, I think it's
Yeah.
Does the area above the garage have a separate? Probably, I guess the tractor and show cars or a D car. Oh, really?
Hello, everyone. Hey. We're so glad to see you here this evening for the second evening of our 11th biennial storytelling festival here at Balmoral. We had a wonderful time last night listening to stories, and we encourage you to return tomorrow morning at 11, if you'd like, to hear Donald tell stories again. You can also visit his website to find more stories, or the International Storytelling Center to find CDs and books. And that's listed out there. You can take a picture of it and take that information home with you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Fran Smart Adicott, and I was the choir director here for 37 years. I know I don't look quite that old, but it's true. And during that time, the Smart Fund was created for the memory of my parents, Hinckley and Vista Smart, in order that the festival could remain free and open to the public. So this is our gift to the neighborhood and to the city and to you this evening. If you'd like to donate to that fund, there's a basket outside in the narthex, and we accept any donations happily, but you don't have to, but we'd love it if you did. And I want to thank those of you who have already contributed, because it does help us to keep this alive and well, and storytelling alive here in this city. If you would like to be on our email list, the easiest way is just to call the church office or email the church office and just leave your email address. And you'll find out when Donald's coming back, and you'll find out when Acoustic Eidolon will be here, or any other musical events or storytelling events that we might have. The concerts last night and tonight are being live streamed. So there are people out there in the hinterland who are watching us. And I'd like to give a shout out to Buddy Nix and his 19 friends who are joining us online tonight. Hello, Buddy. That's so great just to know that storytelling can spread in so many different ways. I'd like to thank Phil and Fran Shannon and Kathy Singleton for all the organizational work that they did to make this possible. And our wonderful helpers out in the narthex that got us in and got us seated and helped us to get started on time. And so, our friend Donald Davis has told stories in just about every venue you could imagine, from NPR to the Smithsonian to CNN and to the World's Fair, and finally here at Balmoral Presbyterian. One writer named his work "Comfort Food for the Soul." I think that's a pretty good description, because I always feel nourished and uplifted when I hear Donald tell stories, and I imagine that you will as well. So open your hearts and your imagination. Help me welcome the Dean of Storytelling, our dear friend, Donald Davis.
Thank you for coming back tonight, or for coming for the first time if we missed you last night. My plan tonight will be to tell you about 4 stories, and if you listen just right, we'll come out by 8:30. You got to do it just right. We'll be just fine. When Fran was telling about some of the different places I've told stories, some of which I've forgotten about, I remember one of the strangest places I was ever asked to come and tell a story was for the dedication of a new septic plant. And the person who wanted me to come there, we were in High Point, North Carolina. It was a whole new septic system for the city. I tell you, wanted me to tell the story about building a new outhouse and digging the hole for it at my grandparents' house, so people would appreciate how much there was a change in progress to have a septic system instead of having to go out and build an outhouse in your backyard. So you run into funny things when you're traveling around doing this. When my parents grew up, they both grew up on farms, of course, through the Depression. And by the time my brother and I came along, my mother was teaching school, 2nd grade at Hazelwood School. My dad was working at the bank. He was the loan department at the bank. But because of their Depression childhood, we didn't live right in town. No, we had to live far enough out on the edge of town that we could have a huge garden. We actually had 2 gardens. Each one of them was more than half the size of this room. One of those entire gardens was nothing but corn and beans. Every 2 weeks, my daddy would plant 4 rows of golden cross spadum corn. 2 weeks later, 4 more rows. 2 weeks later, to keep it just coming in all through the summer. And by the time that first corn got to be about knee-high, he'd go through the rows and punch bean seeds down in there so the beans could grow up on the corn. And that whole garden was just corn and beans. And then we had another whole garden on the other side of a row of apple trees. And that whole garden was everything else, everything from asparagus to zucchini. I remember one time asking my daddy, I said, "Why do we grow zucchini?" He said, "It's to protect the tomatoes." I said, "Well, how does that work?" He said, "Well, up in the summer, you know, we start getting these beautiful big ripe tomatoes, and people come around and they start saying, 'Would you give me a tomato?' Well, you give them 2 zucchinis to go with it, and they won't ask for any more tomatoes." Well, we would can stuff and can stuff and can stuff and can stuff, and I never understood why they called it canning when it was jarred. But we put up enough stuff to eat for about 2 winters. My mother had 6 sisters who were all school teachers, and they lived from Chicago to Florida. And we would have to can enough for them to take home with them when they came to visit. And we'd have to grow enough potatoes for them to take home with them, and have enough apples for them. Well, I mean, we were feeding half the country. And next summer, if we had anything we hadn't eaten, we'd dump it out so she could can it up again in those same jars. We always had chickens. Every year in the springtime, we'd order more chickens. We'd order maybe 4 dozen more chickens from the Sears Roebuck Farm and Ranch catalog. And what we'd do is we'd rotate the brand, the breeds. We'd get Plymouth Rocks one year, and then we'd get Rhode Island Reds one year, and then we get Dominicers the next year, and then we go back and get Plymouth Rocks again. Because, see, we also ate those chickens. And so when my mom would say to my daddy, "Joe, go kill a chicken and cut it up for me to fry," then he would go out and he knew which ones were the older ones. And we'd kill them off and eat them off and let the younger ones keep laying eggs. We'd order those chickens, and we'd be waiting for them to come in the springtime. And one night we'd be eating supper at home, and the telephone would ring, and my dad would answer it, and it'd be Mr. Lonnie Bishop, the postmaster. He'd be saying, "Joe, all the chickens came this afternoon. Everybody in town's chickens came this afternoon. I'm not going home tonight till you come get your chickens. I don't want to come in the morning and have dead chickens in the post office." And we'd drive back into town, and we'd open the door of the post office. It could be 9 o'clock at night, and the whole place would be going, "Cheep, cheep, 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 cheep." And Mr. Bishop would bring out our 4 boxes of chickens. They'd be in little flat boxes with little holes so they could stick their heads out a little bit. And we'd take them home, and we'd get a big corrugated pasteboard box and put it right in the kitchen floor. And we just pour those little chickens out in there. For every dozen you ordered, they'd send you about 15. So if some of them died on the way, you'd still come out ahead. And we'd give them a 40-watt light bulb for a mama. And we put some chicken feed and water down in there. And the first night, they would turn the water over into the chicken feed and then walk around and poo in it all night. And when you went in there for breakfast the next morning, oh, it smelled good, like you just wanted to eat something. And they'd stay in the kitchen floor till they got big enough to fly out of that box. And when they could fly out of that box, that's when my daddy decided they could go outside with the big chickens and start laying eggs and then look forward to being eaten someday. We always had a pig. Now, I'd never heard the word recycle when I was little. You know, that word hadn't come along yet. But as soon as recycle began to be talked about, first thing I thought about was that pig. Because that pig ate everything we did not eat, and then we ate the pig. One night we were having pork chops, and my daddy cut the fat streak off the side of his pork chop, and he held it up on his fork and said to my mama, "Lucille, reckon how many times we've had these same pork chops?" They just went round and round and round through that pig over and over again. We always had a milk cow. For years, we had this Jersey cow whose name was Helen. Now, my daddy said he did not name the cow, that her mama named her. And you know, when a cow's mama names her, you don't just change her name. The reason that was an issue was because we had only one neighbor who lived inside of us, right across our garden. There lived Miss Bergen. And you know what her first name was? Helen. And she would go sit out on her back porch in the afternoon and rock and watch the sun go down. And our pasture ran right up behind her house. And my daddy would go out to milk, and say the cow was up there behind Miss Bergen's house, and she was on the porch in the rocking chair. She was what my daddy described as a right fleshy woman. And he'd look around to see if my mama could hear, because if she couldn't hear, there wasn't any point in doing this. And then in a big loud voice, he'd look at that cow and say, "Oh, Helen, Helen, I'm ready. Come meet me in the barn." My mom would say, "Joe, you stop talking like that right now. Miss Bergen up there thinks you're talking to her." He'd say, "If she doesn't know she's not a cow, it's not my fault." Because my daddy's hobby was annoying my mom. Well, we would put up food, and see, we had potatoes we dug, we had the onions we'd pull up, and the carrots we'd pull up, and we had those 2 rows of apple trees between the 2 gardens, and we'd put up corn, we'd put up beans, and we'd pickle stuff, and we'd make sauerkraut and pickled beans. Oh, it was just wonderful. Well, when I got to the 2nd grade, something happened that totally changed the world. It was 1952, and through the North Carolina State College Extension Service, in our county, they built a cooperative community cannery. They were built in cannery in counties all over North Carolina. And I bet in Tennessee they built them too. And you could take your stuff and go to that cannery, and Miss Seiler, who also ran the school food lunch program, she ran the cannery in the summer, and you could take all your food, and Miss Seiler would help you, and when you got to the end, you had shiny silver tin cans of your own food, just like you got in the store. The place ran off a steam plant, and they had these huge, big steam cookers that everything, you could put 2 bushels of beans in one of those things, and you could probably put, after you cut it off, 50 ears of corn in there. And oh goodness, you got the cans, and the cans were a penny a piece to do that. But if you're canning something acidic like tomatoes, you had to get lined cans, and they were 2 cents a piece. But if you just didn't have the money to do it, you could contribute 10% of what you put up, and the extension lady then labeled it, and it got sold in our local grocery stores. Now, I loved going over there to the cannery with my mom. Usually she and my Aunt Eddie, her next sister, usually they would go together, because that way, they had shared labor they could do. They could put all their beans together, all their corn together, whatever they were going to put up, and they'd go over there and do it. And I would go over, and my job was to take my little brother outside and keep him safely outside so he would not get scalded to death on the steam. And I didn't want to do that, because I'd never seen anybody get scalded to death on the steam, and I wanted to see what it was looking like. Well, the end of the summer came, and they shut the cannery down, except on Saturdays. Everybody was about to finish putting up everything. And one afternoon, my dad came home from work, and he was listening to the radio in the car, and he said, Ken Fry, at the radio station, Ken Fry said, we're going to have our first hard freeze tonight. He said to my mama, you better go out there in the garden and get everything that's left in there, because it won't be any good after that freeze tonight. And my mama headed outside, and she got the rest of the beans, she got the rest of the corn, she got the rest of the okra, she got the rest of the lima beans, she got the peppers, she got stuff she didn't even need to get. She got onions and carrots out of there, even though she didn't even need to do that. And she went up and down our row of apple trees, and she got every apple that had either fallen on the ground or was low enough for her to reach. And she came back in, and my daddy said, well, you got a whole lot of everything and not much of anything. And that's what she had. He said, what are you going to do with this, Lucille? And she said, I've got an idea. Tomorrow is Saturday, and the boys and I could go over there to the cannery, and we'll put everything together and make soup mix. And then in the wintertime, when it's real cold and we don't want to spend a lot of time cooking, we can either add some meat to it, or we don't even need to add some meat to it. We can open a can and we'll have that good mixed up vegetable soup. Well, the next morning we took off. We loaded it all in the car. My daddy had made a joke the night before. He said, I never had vegetable soup that had apples in it. And she said, silly, I'm not putting the apples in the vegetable soup, but I've got enough apples to make a pretty good little run of my good spiced applesauce. Now, we had heard of her good spiced applesauce, but we had never tasted it because it was too good for us to eat. You had to give it away. We had to eat old green applesauce that was watery and didn't have a grain of sugar in it. Over 10 gallons of it wouldn't have a grain of sugar in it. It was just old sour applesauce. Well, we took off and headed over there to the cannery. Miss Seiler was there. She started helping my mama. I went out there with my little brother, to keep him from getting scalded to death. Well, what you did was, the cans came out, and they were just like grocery store cans, except, of course, they didn't have labels on them. And to keep everything straight, way down there at the end, there were 2 racks that had rubber stamps in them. One of them had everything they could think of you could possibly put up at the cannery. Asparagus, beets, carrots, right on through the alphabet all the way through. And the other one had adjustable dates on it. So when you got through and the cans cooled down a little bit, because my mom said if you stamp them when they're too hot, it'll just melt together and you can't see what it says. You could stamp the lids with what was in there and when it was put up, and then when you got home, you knew exactly what you were dealing with. Well, my mama opened the door and she said, now you watch your little brother, but after the soup mix goes through, you can come inside and you can stamp the lids. I loved doing that. Well, my brother and I were outside and he was very boring. There wasn't much to do. But right across the unpaved road from the cannery, there was a pond. It was close to the size of this room. And the little road was unpaved. It went up to the school bus garage. And that road, because it was a county road to the school bus garage, it always had good gravel on it. And that pond just looked like it needed to have rocks thrown in it. And we had a whole road of nice gravel that you could call rocks. And we started working to put those 2 things together. And we threw rocks in the pond, and we skipped rocks on the pond, we plunked rocks in the pond, we threw more rocks in the pond, we tried throwing over our shoulder, we tried throwing between our legs, doing everything we could do. And we were having such a really wonderful time, the time just went by. And all of a sudden, Mom opened the door and she said, the soup mix is going through the processor, where it would process and then seal the lids on the top. She said, in a few minutes, park your little brother on the steps and you can come and stamp the lids. And I said, yes, ma'am. And we kept throwing rocks. We were having a good time throwing rocks, so we were making progress of moving that road. And the time slipped up. All of a sudden, my mama opened the door and she said, did you stamp the soup mix? Now, folks, I knew the kinds of things that my mother likes to hear and the kinds of things that she did not like to hear. And I knew she did not want to hear me say, no. I ignored every word you said and wasted another hour of my life throwing rocks in the pond. I knew she didn't want to hear that, now did she? And so to make her feel better, for her, I said, yes, ma'am, I did it. And we kept throwing rocks. Well, it was no time till the door opened again, and she said, now the applesauce has gone through. Come in and stamp the applesauce. Miss Seiler and I are going to clean up. You can let Joe come in with you because we turned all the steam off now. And we went around, came in the other end of that building, and there must have been, good gracious, 75 or more tin cans. And every one of them looked exactly like every other one. And I said, Joe, I need your help. He said, what? I said, half of these are applesauce and half of them are soup mix. Which one do you want to stamp? He said, I'll stamp the applesauce. Which ones are they? I said, every other one. We went down through there side by side, stamping them right up. Soup mix applesauce, all the way through. And then we put the dates on them just right. And my mama came down there, and we had done such a good job because by now we had separated them according to what was in them. And she even got the boxes that the empty cans had come out of, and we organized them and put them in there, and we took them all home like that, and we took them down in this hole under the back porch that they tried to call a basement, and everything was fine. Till about December. Well, being Methodist, we had a new district superintendent that year, and he was invited before Christmas to come preach at our church. My daddy loved to go to church. He loved it. He would sing. Now, he wouldn't sing in the choir, because if you sang in the choir, you had to sing those songs old Miss Martin picked out. But he loved the hymns. And we would get there and he would sing and sing and sing, and then he'd sit down through the offering, and then the sermon would start. And when the sermon would start, my daddy's lower jaw would never move. And the rest of his head would gradually tilt back. And my mother was scared to touch him. Because if she just touched him, he would say, "I'm not asleep." Well, that's the reason he liked going to church, I think, because it was the only time he could have an undisturbed nap in the course of the whole week, and nobody would bother him. Well, then when the last hymn would come along, and he'd wake up and sing again. Now, the church would be over, and there were 3 perfectly usable escape routes out there. And my daddy would insist on going out the door where the preacher was shaking hands with me. And here we'd go. We'd be behind him. My mom would be right behind him. I'd be next. My little brother would be last. We'd be like a little row of ducks. And my dad would shake hands with the preacher, and he would say, "That was fine." And I knew he was talking about his nap. And then he'd say, "Why don't you come home and have dinner with us?" And right behind him, my mother would be going, and our preacher could read sign language. And he'd say to my daddy, "Oh, no, thank you for asking, but we've already got a plan made." Well, then the Sunday came when the district superintendent came to preach. And first thing was, since he didn't have to come back the next week, he didn't care how long he went on. And Daddy got a good long nap that day. And it was over, and we started out through that line, and my mom was right behind my daddy, and he stuck his hand out and shook hands with the visiting preacher and said, "That was fine. Why don't you come home and have dinner with us?" And that visiting superintendent didn't know who that crazy woman in line was who was dancing around all over the place. And he said, "We'd love to." And up until that moment, we didn't know there was a we to it. But he had a wife and 3 underfed children on the back row. And we went out and got in the car. Ooh, it was cold in that car. My mama said, "What in the world have you done? I have not made any kind of plan for Sunday dinner, and you have invited somebody to come and eat with us. I do not know. Why do you do things like this without even talking to me or without asking me?" And my daddy said, "Lucille, it's been what you've been waiting for. Remember when you and Eddie canned all those chickens, when you killed 20 chickens one day and you put up that nice chicken meat? Go get a can of chickens and make some nice chicken and dumplings. Go down there, get some green beans, get some beets, get something else." And the way my daddy had told those people how to go to get to our house, it gave my mama a good head start. And by the time they got there, indeed, she almost had a wonderful Sunday dinner ready to eat. And we sat down, and everybody had as much as or more than they needed to eat. And the minister said, "Oh, that was so good. That was so good, Miss Davis." And my daddy said, "It was good, Lucille. What's for dessert?" I think I was about 7 years old, and we hadn't had dessert in about 25 years. And my mother hemmed a little bit, and she says, I know. Let's just have some of my good spiced applesauce." And she said to me, run down there in the basement and get a can of it. And I went downstairs and got a can that said applesauce on it, brought it upstairs, and as soon as the can opener made that little whoosh sound, you could smell that it wasn't spiced applesauce. We took the lid off and it was green beans, and then carrots, and then some onion. It was soup mix. My mom said, it's dark down there. Turn the light on when you go back so you can see. Get applesauce. I brought another can of applesauce up there and we opened it and it was soup mix. We went through 6 cans of soup mix before we finally, my mom said, go down there and get one that says soup mix on it. And we finally hit the applesauce. Well, the next Sunday we went back to church and a regular minister was back. And this time as we came out through the line, my mama was right behind my daddy, and when he stuck his hand out to shake hands with the preacher, my mama got a 2-hand hold on his coat tail. And he said, that was mighty fine. And she went, yink. And he said, I'll see you next Sunday. And never again did he ever invite anybody to come eat dinner at our house unless he had talked to my mama probably 2 weeks ahead of time. I went to Hazelwood School through the 6th grade and then moved to junior high school. And on the first day in the 7th grade, our teacher, Miss Plarski, got up and she started talking about something we had never heard anybody talk about this in 6 years of school. She said, boys and girls, we have to make choices. You know, in the first 6th grade, you didn't make any choices. You just did what the teacher said. We thought, oh my goodness, what's this going to be? She said, we have to make decisions about our extracurricular activities. She said, how many of you boys think you would like to play football? Now, I don't know what I weighed in the 7th grade, but it is documented on a little square blue card called my first driver's license. When I was 16 years old, I weighed 89 pounds. So I didn't raise my hand for those who were going to play football. Well, she wrote down a whole bunch of boys' names, and she said, now how many of you girls think you might like to be cheerleaders? And there was a little handful of girls that, she wrote their names down, and she says, now, boys and girls both, how many of you think you would like to be in the band? And I just sat there and watched my hand go home. My brain wasn't even connected to it. I thought, I guess we're going to be in the band. And the night after that day we went over and met with the band director, talked about things, and then that evening, my mother and daddy took me over to the band building where my daddy shelled out $60 for a second-hand King trumpet. And I was now a member of the band. My best friend, David Morgan, was there too. His aunt, who worked with my daddy at the bank, she'd brought him because David was an orphan who lived with her and his grandmother. And he thought he got a better deal than I did because the $60 his aunt spent to buy him an alto saxophone, a used alto saxophone, it came with a whole box of used reeds. Well, we were now in the band. And we met our band director, Mr. Bob Campbell. Now, Mr. Campbell had been the junior high band director and then the assistant, high school band director and for chorus and orchestra and the whole music program. He had been there for about 5 or 6 years. He had graduated from Davidson College, and his father had a business down in Charlotte, North Carolina, wanted him to come and take over the family business. But all he wanted to do was work with children and teach school. His father had even bought him a brand new 1953 Plymouth as a graduation present, trying to bribe him even farther to come and join the band. No. He had that Plymouth, but he almost never did drive it. He rode a little motor scooter all around town. Well, he was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful teacher, musician, band director, because he was the first teacher I ever had who really had high expectations of us. He believed we could do it. He convinced us that we could do it. And when somebody believes that about you, guess what? It happens. We started gradually learning to play. And I remember when we got far enough along that we had our first musical tryouts. We were learning to play a little march called Our Director. Da-da-da-da-da. And what we had to do was, he had a record of that march in the same key in which we were learning it. And so he would play the record, and one at a time, we would have to get up in front of the band, and we'd have to play our part with the record while we marched in a little rectangle. 8 steps on the end, 16 on the side, 8 on the end, 16 on the side, all the way through to the end. I think I made about 50 mistakes. And that whole march was just 64 bars long. And when it was all over, I was surprised more than anybody else when Mr. Campbell announced that in the trumpet section, Donald Davis was first chair. But he had to go on to explain why it turned out that way. He said, let me explain this to you. He said, Donald did not make the fewest mistakes. In the mistake department, he was way on up there. But he did something that nobody else did. No matter how many times he messed up, he just kept going. And if you're going to be in the band, you can't stop and fix a mistake. You got to just keep going. And it was years before I realized that was not just a lesson about being in the band. That was about all of life. We loved Mr. Campbell. You know, you could do something bad and you could get kicked out of the band, but you could earn your way back in, by coming on Saturday and cleaning all the windows in the band building with glass wax and newspaper. And then the second offense was to take a scraper and scrape all the illegal chewing gum off the bottom of all the metal folding chairs in the whole band building. And then the third offense was to take all the brass instruments that belonged to the school and take them apart and clean them inside and out, and sanitize them all over again. You could always earn your way back, so nobody did anything wrong, pretty soon. Well, we made progress, and we got up to the spring of the year. And he said, now, boys and girls, a special, wonderful thing's going to happen. The high school band does their spring concert. And we made so much progress, we're going to put the 7th grade and the 8th grade bands together. And together, you get to play one number before the high school spring concert. But to do that, since 7th grade was one period at school and 8th grade was another period, we were going to have Tuesday night band practice all together. He said, we'll come at 7 o'clock Tuesday night. It's a school night. We'll practice exactly 1 hour, and then we'll go home. Well, that first Tuesday night came. My mother took off to take me. We went by and picked up my friend David. We got there about 10 minutes early. Right at 7 o'clock, when the little red hand on the clock went up and hit 12, Mr. Campbell walked out, stepped on his little one-step podium, and we started practicing. 8 o'clock came, we just kept practicing. 5 after 8 came, we were still practicing. 10 after 8 came. We were still practicing. 11 minutes and 25 seconds after 8, he put down his baton and he said, "That's an hour. Let's go home." We said, "Wait a minute. We started at 7 and we practiced till 11 and a half minutes after 8. He said, "Oh no, boys and girls. Some of you started at 7. But some of you were late." In fact, Rabbi McCracken didn't get here till 11 minutes and 25 seconds after 8. And until everyone is here, we're not practicing. We're just warming up. And I realized that was not just about the band either. It was about all of life. Unless we're all there, we're not starting yet. Well, we got to the end of that year, and summer went along while school was out. And then the plan was, so we were gradually learning how to move toward a high school band. We were going to have band practice once a week for the month of August before school started. Because the high school band had to do this to get ready for the first halftime show. We better go ahead and start doing that so we can learn and start getting it into the insides of us. So we had our band practice. It was on a Thursday, the first week of August, and the band practice went just fine, and we were all glad to be back together again and see Mr. Campbell again. And then we came back the next week for the second week, and we were about halfway through practice when all of a sudden, without even a knock on the door, you know how somebody can open the door and make you hear it when they open it? All of a sudden, the door opened, and in came Mr. Bowles, the school superintendent. And Mr. Campbell came to an abrupt stop. And Mr. Bowles walked over and turned his back on us. So Mr. Campbell had to turn his back on us too. And they had an increasingly heated discussion. And then Mr. Bowles turned on his heel and marched out the door. Mr. Campbell said, "Practice is over. You can use the phone to call your parents to come get you early. We're finished." And he walked out the door. The next morning, the news was all over town. Mr. Bob Campbell had quit, packed up, and left before it was dark that afternoon before. And nobody knew anything else about it. We heard he went to California. We heard he was in a place called Glendale, California. And once in a while there was a rumor, you know, when Lawrence Welk was on Saturday night, you'd come to the end of the show and they'd play and people would dance, you know, people in the audience would dance. Somebody would say, "I think I saw Mr. Campbell dancing with a woman on Lawrence Welk." But nobody knew if that was true or not, or just imagination. And you know what happens as time passes? The memory of him just went away. It was the weekend following 9/11. I had a performance scheduled in my hometown. There was conversation about whether to have it, and I said, "I'm going to be there and have it, whether anybody else is there or not, because if we allow terrorists to interrupt our schedule, they have accomplished their mission." And I was there, and we had it, and had a great time. It was the right thing to do. Well, when it was over, an old friend, Ernestine Upchurch, came up to talk to me. She was a little bit older than I was, and we talked, and she said, "Where are you going from here?" And I said, "Well, we're going to Monterey, and then from Monterey, we're coming back to Bakersfield, California, and then we're coming back to Oklahoma City." She said, "Bakersfield. Do you remember Mr. Bob Campbell, the junior high band director?" I said, "Sure, I had him the last year when he had 7th grade band, and we were looking into the 8th grade when he left." She said, "You know, he and I have exchanged Christmas cards ever since he left here. And he now lives in Bakersfield. That's where he retired after he was in Glendale." And I thought, when we get there, I'm going to find that man. Well, we got out to Monterey, and I thought, okay, let me plan a little bit ahead of time. And I did something that you could do back in those days. I got information on the telephone. I got information for Bakersfield, and I asked if they had a listing for a Mr. Robert Campbell. And the lady looked up, and she said, we have a listing for an R.A. Campbell Jr. on Horseman Boulevard. And I thought, that's it, because he was Robert A. Campbell Jr. I remember that then in that moment. And I got the number, and I called it, and an older man answered the telephone. I said, Mr. Campbell? He said, yes. I said, were you ever a band director in Waynesville, North Carolina? And he said, is this Ernie Edwards? Ernie Edwards got kicked out of the band about every other week, but he always earned his way back in. I said, no, this is Donald Davis. And there was that kind of silence that you can't fix. The very loudly says, I have no idea who in the world you are. Well, he started trying to fix it, but it was too late by then. And I said, I'm a storyteller. I'm performing in Monterey now, and 3 days from now, I'm going to be at the Beale Memorial Library in Bakersfield. He said, the Beale Library, that's where I volunteer 3 days a week. It's close to where I live. How early can you get here? I said, well, we've got to drive from Monterey, but we'll get there. He said, come early, and we'll go to dinner at my favorite Basque restaurant, and we'll catch up with things. So we headed over there, and we actually got there in the reasonable late afternoon. We've been in the car for a while, and my late wife, Merle, took off with our dirty clothes to try to find a place where we could leave it and then pick it up later. And while she was gone, I was in the room, and Mr. Campbell called. He said, I'm down in the lobby. Are you ready to go have dinner together? I said, well, my wife ran out to take our laundry to get it done, and she'll be back real soon. Why don't we leave her directions, and I'll go on with you? He said, you can't go with me. I'm on the motor scooter. Well, we waited around for a few minutes, and she did get back, and we got in the car, and here we took off, 105-degree temperature in Bakersfield, California, following a 74-year-old man riding a motor scooter wide open, changing lanes on a 5-lane highway. And we got to his favorite Basque restaurant. He had talked them into letting us in at 5 o'clock, even though they opened at 5:30, so we could have a head start to get to the library. Well, we were eating our supper, and finally the confession came out. He said, I got to tell you something. When you called, I have no memory in this world of who you were. I said, I knew that. I could tell that. He said, but I called Ernestine, and she called me up. You're Joe Davis's boy at the bank. He said, let me tell you what your daddy did for me. He said, I was a new teacher. I taught 1 year, and I had an opportunity to go on a summer trip to Europe, and I had no money. And somebody found out about it and told your daddy. And he came to me, and he said, Bob, you'll never have a chance to do something like this again. I will loan you the money to go on that summer trip to Europe, and you can pay it back over time. And he said, I paid it back in 6 months after that, and that trip was the most wonderful thing up to that point in my life. And we visited and caught up on all kinds of things. It was wonderful. And then all of a sudden he said, did you ever know why I left Waynesville? I said, no, I don't think much of anybody did. He said, well, they didn't, and that was for the best. It was better for people to think anything they wanted to about me than to know what really happened. He said it was 1958, and they were talking about integrating the schools, but it hadn't happened yet. And we had started band practice there in August, and the teachers hadn't even gotten their contracts yet. And that day when we had practice, Mr. Bowles came over there with my contract. And what he wanted me to do was, he wanted me to take the contract from him and then ask him if we were going to integrate the schools. And if he said yes, I was going to refuse to sign the contract and hand it back to him and quit, so all the teachers would quit and we wouldn't even have school. He said, when I heard that idea, I knew I would have nothing more to do with Haywood County. I'd already had a job offer in Glendale. And I walked out the door and tore up the contract and made a phone call and went right up to where I boarded the Glavish's house and packed everything I owned in the car, and I was headed west before sunset. I was only the third person who ever heard that story. We went to the library, and I had a wonderful time there, wonderful time. He talked the library director into letting him introduce me and acted like he had known me every moment of his life. He did a great job. And toward the end of my performance, I thought, you know, they know this old man. He's a retired volunteer at the library. He's a retired teacher that some of them may remember, but he's been retired now for 7 years, so their memories are running out now. I need to tell them about the person I knew when I was in the 7th grade. And I told them about how I made first chair and how he taught all of us that if you're going to be part of a band, it means work together. So everybody takes, and about how he learned us that being on time means being early, and getting there on time means being late. And actually being late is just totally, absolutely unacceptable. And I looked over and he had his head down toward his lap and he was weeping. And I thought, what have I done? And I finished up pretty quickly and people visited and spoke, and then they left, and then he came over and he said, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I said, what? He said, you know when you called that first time, and I had no idea who you were? If you'd been somebody I remembered, and you had told people the things about me you told them tonight, I think I could have taken it. But when a child I did not remember I had ever taught, when a child I never remembered ever existed, stood up and told people almost 40 years later that I'd made changes in his entire life, I guess I just came apart. Well, after that night, Mr. Campbell and I had a correspondence relationship. We would write a couple of times a year. He had a caravan, we call it a camper, that he kept in Australia. And in our wintertime, he would go to Australia and travel about and live in his camper and come back again. He had never married it, but he had adopted 2 children, 2 high school students who had no one to take care of them, and sent both of them to college. And some years later, he left California when he got into his 80s and moved to Alexandria, Virginia to be near one of those guys he had adopted as he finished the course of his whole life. I talked to him on the phone the last time when he was 92 years old. One of our classmates had become the director of the band at Western Carolina University, and the band had grown to over 400 members, called the Pride of the Mountains Band. And they were invited twice to the Rose Bowl and then to the Macy's parade in New York. And Mr. Campbell was so proud that a student he had started off and ended up doing this, that he had made a trip to go visit one of their rehearsals and then talk to the band when it was over. We marched 64 people when I was in high school. Bobby Buckner's band was marching 512 students at the Macy's parade. This year I got a phone call about August from one of our band members, Larry Emmons. And he said, I called because I don't know whether you know about Mr. Campbell. 94 years old, totally in wonderful health. He said they checked everybody for COVID there at the retirement village where he lives, and it was all negative. Everybody came out negative. But then, in the days after that, it slipped in somehow. And he got COVID, and yesterday, Mr. Campbell died. You know, people tend to say something like, well, he was 94 years old. But was that the way he deserved to finish his life? I don't think so. And so I have to tell the story because no matter where you search, you will find no documented evidence of Bob Campbell's life except a tiny obituary from last year. But now you know the man. And you're not going to be late either, are you? My dad was number 8 of 13 children. All of his siblings were born from 1885 to 1911. My granddaddy was born in 1850. But right in the middle of those 13 children, there were 4 boys right in a tight row. They were just a year apart. There was my Uncle Moody, my Uncle Harry, my daddy, and my Uncle Frank. And when I was growing up, they were the majority male influence on my life. None of them married until they were past 40. My dad was 44 when I was born. And they were all older men like that. And, you know, I thought they were hilarious. They were just absolutely hilarious, total characters. My Uncle Harry had gotten, well, let me start this way. My Uncle Moody, the oldest, he had gone off in the First World War. And he was just enough older than Uncle Harry that Uncle Harry, you know, didn't have to go yet. Uncle Moody ended up in France as a fireman on a landing. Remember those old First World War biplane, you know, canvas and wood planes? He was a fireman where they landed at the landing field. Imagine putting out planes coming in all shot up and on fire. And Uncle Harry hadn't gone yet, and we got a letter, the family got a letter from Uncle Moody saying he was coming home. And the family wondered, well, will Moody get home before Harry has to leave? You know, will he get back? Will they see each other? Well, he did not get back, and it's time for Uncle Harry to go, and he took off. He had to ride the train from Waynesville to Asheville, from Asheville down to Charlotte, and they were heading toward Newport News, Virginia, where they were going to be shipped overseas. Well, the whole trainload of soldiers stopped in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, for the whole trainload to get off and have lunch at the train station. And he got off and went in the train station. There was another trainload of soldiers coming the other way, coming back home, and right there in the train station was his brother Moody. And they hugged and ran into each other, you know, and had a great big old time and a big old reunion. And right about then, all the church bells started ringing and car horns started blowing, and the word came. It was the 11th of November. It was actually the 12th of November that the word had arrived that at 11 o'clock the night before, the armistice had been signed and the war was over. And one of them said to the other one, we better get out of here and get jobs before the young men get back. And they headed out in Winston-Salem, and both of them got jobs as policemen because the young men were gone and older men had been filling in on the police department through the war. In a very short time, both of them got new jobs. My Uncle Harry got a job as the police chief in the little town of Leakesville, just a little way out of Winston-Salem. And his brother Moody got a job as the police chief in a little town of Spray outside of Winston-Salem. Those towns no longer exist. They were joined together, Leakesville, Spray, and Draper. Now, if you've ever heard of Eden, North Carolina, that's the consolidated city that replaced all of it. By the time I was coming along, Uncle Harry, in the Second World War, when a lot of car dealerships closed down, he had bought a Chrysler Plymouth dealership. And he was a mechanic and sort of an inventor, and he loved to run his car dealership. He would bring us a new car about every other year, you know, one that was so ugly he knew nobody was going to buy it, and he'd just give it to his brother. And we'd go see him, and he had invented this thing he called his Robot Man. It had legs made out of stovepipe, and little feet made out of stovepipes, and a body made out of a trash drum, and a head made out of a bucket, and two eyes made out of bug lights. And it had a little radio speaker for its mouth, and he could let it run on these little wheels down the little ramp in front of his car dealership out to the sidewalk, and it had a wire that came inside, and he could look out the window and talk to a microphone, and the little Robot Man was talking. And he'd roll it down when the children were walking their way home from school. And little Robot Man would roll down and talk to all the children. Its lights would blink on and blink off. And he'd ask them questions. He knew who their teachers were, knew who their parents were. They just couldn't believe how smart that robot was. I loved to go visit him. He had one finger that he had cut part of it off working on a car. And he had what was left of a nail looked like a little kernel of popcorn. And he would say, "Want to know what happened to my finger?" And I always wanted to know, because every time it was a totally different story. You know, a championship rooster to State Fair pecked it off. Or it got chopped off in a sword fight in the South Pacific Ocean. He was in the Army, not in the Navy. You know, he had got chopped off working in a car by the fan blade. You know, and no matter how many times you ask, it was always different. We loved to go see him. Then sometimes we'd go see my Uncle Moody. By now, he had quit being a policeman, and he had a wholesale grocery business. He and Aunt Rebecca didn't have any children, but growing up on a farm, he thought he needed to teach city children about what a farm was like. One day we were visiting, and he said to me, "Go with me, let's do something." And we went to the garden, you know, lawn and garden store, and we got a great big old bale of straw. And we brought it to his house, and went back in the woods behind the house, and we opened up that bale of straw, and we got it all apart, and we built what looked like a great big round nest on the ground out of straw. A big old nest, about maybe 3 or 4 feet across. And then we went to the store and got 2 glass bottles of milk, quart bottles of milk, and put them in that nest. And when the children came toward home that afternoon, he met them at the sidewalk and says, "Children, children, children, a cow has built a nest in the woods behind my house. Come back here and see quick. It's been laying milk back there." And they went back, and of course, there was a cow-sized nest. And it had 2 quart bottles of milk in it. And they just couldn't believe it. They went on and on. And one day, he took them back there, and there was a quart of white milk and a quart of chocolate milk. And he said, "How in the world do you think that happened?" And one little boy raised his hand and says, "I believe she lays that chocolate milk in the dark." He would also buy chewing gum and take the outside wrapper off and just leave, you know, the silver wrapper. And then he'd stick that chewing gum in cracks in a locust tree in the front yard. And he told the children, "The chewing gum tree's in bloom. Come over here and see what you can pick off of it." And it was wonderful. They just loved, you know, harvesting the chewing gum off of the chewing gum. Now, wouldn't you love people like that? And see, by the time I was 7 or 8 years old, they were in their 50s. You know, they were getting over being embarrassed about anything. They'd do anything. My Uncle Frank was the youngest one, and he inherited the family farm. And one day he came to our house and he said to my daddy, he was laughing his head off, all dressed up. And my daddy said, "Where you been, Frank?" And he laughed again. He said, "I've been to Guy Chambers' funeral." Daddy said, well, what's so funny about it? He said, oh, it was the best funeral. It's worth having a guy die just to get to go to. He said, I got up there earlier and there wasn't anybody there except the grave digger checking on everything, from opening the grave the day before. And he came running down when I pulled in the parking lot and he said, Frank, we got to stop the funeral, stop the funeral. Frank said, we can't stop the funeral. The guy went on and died. He said, well, I don't know what we're going to do. In the night, a skunk fell in the grave. Come up here and look. And they went and looked, and there was a big old skunk just going round and round down there in the grave. Well, Uncle Frank said he knew this grave digger, and he knew why he was a grave digger. And he said he had an idea. And he said to the man, he said, if that skunk were right here beside us, and it wanted to squirt us, what would be the last thing it had to do before it squirted? And the man thought a minute, and finally he said, lift up its tail. And Uncle Frank says that is exactly right. It cannot squirt until it lifts up its tail. He said, now think about this and follow me on it. A skunk has enough muscles in its tail to lift up its tail. But if you should pick that skunk up by the tail, it does not have enough muscles in its tail to lift up its whole body, and you got it locked shut. He said, now I would do this first part, except I hurt my knee. But if you'll just jump down in there and grab that skunk by the tail and lock it shut and hand it up here, I'll carry it over and toss it across the fence and we can go on with the funeral. My daddy said, what did you do, Frank? Frank said, you don't smell anything, do you? He grabbed it up. It didn't squirt him. I figured if it didn't squirt him, it's not going to squirt me. And I got it, and I tossed it across the fence, and it ran off in the woods. A guy is in the ground with no skunk. Every time we'd go see that man, there'd be something like that. It was just on and on and on. It never ended. And then my daddy, he was as entertaining as the rest of them. I remember in kindergarten, one day we went on a little field trip, and we went on a field trip to the bank. Walked all the way down the street from the Methodist Church to First National Bank. We went inside. My daddy was there to meet us. Ms. Rosemary had already made the plane. He showed us everything in the bank. He showed us how the coin wrapping machine and the coin separator, and he made it fascinating. And then he said, do you want to see where we keep the money? And he took us back in the big old Mosler vault. First there were the safe deposit boxes. And then way back in the back, these bars, and behind the bars, there were sacks of coins and flat canvas bags of currency. And we were just all studying that like everything. And he and Miss Rosemary slipped out and cut off the light and locked us in. And we screamed and screamed and screamed and screamed and screamed and screamed. And then he opened the door and we came running out. And he said, that's what we do to every robber who ever comes in this bank. And you better not be one. There never was a bank robbery in Waynesville. My daddy scared it out of everybody. Well, my whole life they'd been there. They'd been there. They'd been there. They were bigger than life. You know, bigger than life. And then after my junior year in high school, I'd been to Western Carolina University for band camp. And my parents picked me up and they said, we're not going home. We're going straight to Leakesville. And I said, why? My daddy said, Uncle Harry had a massive heart attack and died last night. We're going for the funeral. And we went down, and I remember sitting with my mother and my little brother on the second row, while my daddy and Uncle Moody and Uncle Frank, with a blank space in the middle of them, sat next to Mansoula on the first row. And as I sat there spaced like that, I thought, you know, more than just one person's died. One person's died, but a fourth of the whole is also missing. Well, years rolled along. I finished high school. I went off to Davidson College. And one night, you know, there was one phone in the whole dormitory. On the first floor, a little phone booth. And when you came in, you'd hopefully look to see if anybody had called, and there was a little note for you to call back. I never got one. And then one afternoon, I came in and looked, and it said, Donald Davis, call your mother. And my mother, I had to talk to my mother because my daddy couldn't tell me. The day before, his brother Moody, my Uncle Moody, retired now from the grocery business, but had a part-time job for a real estate company inspecting houses. He'd go down to inspect a house and had never come back. And then went out and he had had a massive heart attack and died. And we made that same trip down to the same town, but a different church. And I sat again on the second row with my mother and my little brother, and I watched my Aunt Rebecca sit there with my daddy on one side, two spaces, and Uncle Frank on the other side, and they were half gone. A few years passed, maybe 3 years passed. And it was my daddy who called this time. He said, it's Frank, his little brother, 2 years younger. He went out to the barn to milk. Uncle Frank was a roll-it-your-own chain smoker. He went 68 years old. He went out to the barn to milk, and he didn't come back, and Kathleen found him. Massive heart attack, and he died. And this time we went to the mountains, back to the church where my daddy and Uncle Frank had grown up, back to the cemetery where my grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents are all residing. And I watched my daddy sit there by himself with my Aunt Kathleen. And 3/4 of those boys were gone. So see, it was no surprise 3 years later. I was a Methodist minister in Lexington, North Carolina, when one morning about 5 o'clock, I was awakened by the telephone ring. That happens sometimes in the parsonage. And I picked up the telephone. Do you have relatives? As soon as you hear their voice, you know who it is. You don't have to say, who is this? And you know. And as soon as I picked up the telephone and said hello, it was my cousin Kay. My cousin Kay said, Donald, it's your daddy. Your mama just couldn't get him awake this morning. They took him to the hospital anyway, but he's gone. I said, I'll be there as soon as we can. We can't leave right now. It's got to get late enough for me, before cell phones, for me to make some phone calls to be gone on Sunday, but we'll be on the way as soon as we can. And I hung up the phone and walked across the hall into the bedroom where our firstborn, now 4-year-old baby was asleep. And that's when it really hit me. He would never have a grandparent. And that's when there began to boil up from inside all the questions I should have asked and hadn't. I kept thinking, where did my daddy start off to school? What did he do before he and my mother met? It just kept going, and it kept going, and it kept going, and it kept going. Finally, it got a little bit later. I made a couple of calls to plan to be gone, for Sunday. We finally got, by the time it was decent for us to go, almost 3 hours had passed. And I thought, I better call and let them know we're just now leaving, because if we had left when Kay called, we'd be there now. and they're going to be worried. And I hated to make the phone call. See, my dad was the phone answering person. My mother did not like to talk on the telephone, and when I would call home, the phone would ring 2 times. Ring, ring, and then a bright voice would say, "Hello, this is Joe Davis. What can I do for you?" If the phone rang more than twice, I knew he wasn't there. And it would ring a 3rd time, and ring a 4th time, and finally, about the 5th ring, I'd hear my mother say, "Hello?" I say, "Mom, this is Donna." "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." "Are you sick?" "No, I'm not sick." "Are one of the children sick?" "No, they're not sick." "Do you need some money?" "No, I don't need some money." I hated now to make this phone call, but it had to be done. I picked up the phone and I dialed the number 456-5697, our number since the book of Genesis. And the phone went ring, ring, and all of a sudden this bright voice said, "Well, hello, this is Joe Davis. What can I do for you?" There was no answering machine. It was my father. And I dropped the phone. And I scrambled around and got it, and you know, my mouth's talking now, not my brain. And I stupidly said, "You're supposed to be dead." And he said, "Well, I'm not dead. What are you talking about?" I said, "We're on the way. I'll explain it when we get there. We're coming." We had to go anyway and see. And we drove up to the mountains and got there. My dad came out and met us at the car. And we hugged, and I told the whole story. I explained everything. We called my cousin Kay. She had no idea what I was talking about. She said, "I didn't call you. I didn't call you." And we couldn't put it together. And we stayed for the weekend because the plans were made, and then I went back home and gradually began to figure it out. 2 weeks before that, a young man named Donald Davis had moved from Lexington, Virginia to Lexington, North Carolina. He was a new writer with the newspaper. That's how I stumbled across his name and began to put this together. Because when I got back home, his byline began popping up in the Enterprise. His father's name was Joe. His mother's name was Lucille. Because he had just moved 2 weeks before, nobody back at home had a phone number for him. When his father died, his sister called information and was given our number. She called. She also thought she knew who she was talking to, and there was never a question raised. She thought I was her brother. The mystery in their family was, she knew she had called him. Why didn't he remember it? And finally, it was all put together. So you know what started happening that day. I started asking questions. And my daddy started telling me stuff. And most of the stories I tell about him, the whole book I did called Crippled Joe, Stories About My Daddy, almost all of that stuff is stuff I learned from him after the first time he died. Now, you know why I'm telling this. You may not have the same chance I had. You may only get to die once. So start telling stuff. Doesn't matter if they want to hear it or not. Tell it anyway. Later on, they'll be so glad it happened. And ask questions. Anybody who's still around, ask questions, ask questions, ask questions. I met a lady, she was in a workshop I had in Frisco, Texas. And we were talking, and this is what she said. She said, "Back when I turned 90, I thought, how old are you now? She said, "Back when I turned 90, I decided to give myself a birthday party. And everybody in my generation was dead and gone, so I could tell anything. She said, I'd given away everything I wanted to give away, but I hadn't given away my memories yet. And so I invited all the relatives to come to this birthday party, but to get in, and I was going to have a bouncer there to be sure they did this, to let them in. To get in, they had to do two things. They had to come up with 2 questions about anything in the world they wanted me to answer. And they had to write those questions out, and without their names on it, send them in ahead of time. Because I didn't want people just at the last minute just slopping out some old question they'd thought of without thinking about it. And I wanted people to know they could ask a question and nobody else knew who it was that asked it. And we got there and we started going through everything, and she said, now I'm ready to go, because now I've completely passed on my memories. Isn't that a wonderful thing to think of? Remember that whenever you remember this story. Well, last night I finished up with a little Christmas story, so I think I'll do the same thing tonight. My dad and mother were nearly 20 years apart in age. And he actually had 2 hobbies. One hobby was, annoying my mama. And the other hobby, partly because of their age difference, was spoiling my mama. And it was a beautiful thing to watch. He was so good at it, sometimes he could annoy her and spoil her at exactly the same time. I remember one of my favorite things to do, my brother's favorite things, was to watch what my daddy got her for Christmas, because that was one of those moments when he could do both things at once. First time I remember, I was maybe 7 or 8 years old, and my mother picked up this present from my dad. It was flat, it was long, it was wide, and she opened it up, and it was this beautiful match set of seven little yellow-handled screwdrivers. And even had a little rack you could put up on the kitchen wall with all those little screwdrivers right there. And anytime, didn't he spoil her? Now, didn't he spoil her? She was the first one of her sisters that had her own weed eater. But the time I remember when he outdid himself was when I was 11 years old. And my mother opened a beautiful big square box, and she just screamed, "You got it! You got it! You got it!" As it unfolded, as she pulled it out, it was a full-length, bright red wool overcoat. And she put the coat on, and she says, "Joe, how did you know? How did you know? How did you know I wanted this?" I knew how he knew. He had watched her try it on 50 times and turned her store. If he hadn't figured it out by now, he was done. Well, he said, "Did I get the right size?" And you could see her kind of going, She needed 1 or 2 sizes larger. But she was so flattered because he had gotten the little one. She never said a word about it. Well, in a little while, we'd opened our presents, and then it was time for all of us to go to my Aunt Eddie's house, because this year, it was her turn to have the whole family. We got the food in the car, we got the family presents in the car, we rode out to their house, pulled up in the driveway, a bunch of cars are already there ahead of us, some more still coming. I got out with my mother, my dad got out with my little brother, they got the presents out of the back seat and went inside, and my mother and I went around to the trunk and we got the food. You know what we took. One time one of our boys said to his mama, he said, "Mama, can you even make deviled eggs if you're not going anywhere?" Yep, and that Tupperware thing with the little bumps around the outside of it, deviled eggs in the middle, orange Jello with grated carrot in it. Well, we get the food out, and I said, Mama, you didn't take the tags off of your new coat. And sure enough, with strings right here, there were cardboard tags on the side. She stuffed them in the pocket. She said, shh, don't tell your daddy, it's too little. I just forced my way into it today, but I got to take it back up there Monday and swap it for a bigger one, and I don't want to pull the tags off. We headed in the house, and in there was my Aunt Eddie. Aunt Eddie was only 10 months younger than my mom. They had grown up like twins. They'd gone to school in the same grade together. They looked almost exactly alike, except my Aunt Eddie was about 2 sizes smaller than my mother. Well, she saw that coat. She said, Lucille, you got it. They had both been trying on those coats. And my mama said, did you get one too? She said, oh, we've been working so hard for people to come out here. We haven't even opened any presents. And you know David Boyd would never spend enough money to buy me a coat like that. And my mama said, well, try mine on. It's too little for me. It'll probably fit you just right. And Aunt Eddie put that coat on, and sure enough, it fit her perfectly. She just about cried. She says, I'll never have a coat like this. Well, we took our coats and we put them on the bed in the front bedroom. And we went in the kitchen and we started into a whole semester of eating. There was my grandmother, my granddaddy, my mother and her 6 sisters, and the 7 men who had married those 7 girls. My mother's 2 little brothers. One of them was married, one of them didn't ever know he was going to need to be married. A whole bunch of what eventually was 30 cousins. Well, part of the way through the meal, my Uncle David, my Aunt Eddie's husband, and my Uncle Ralph, my Aunt Mary Grace's husband, they just slipped out of the kitchen. And they went up in that front bedroom, and they got my mother's new coat. And they put it in a box and wrapped it as a Christmas present from Uncle David to my Aunt Eddie, and they put it under the tree. Well, in a little while, it was time to go open all the presents. We went in there. Pretty soon, there was paper flying everywhere, ribbons all over the place. There were cousin presents and brother and sister presents and aunt and uncle presents. And somebody said, look, David, this big one right here, give it to Eddie. And he gave it to Eddie. Said, here, Eddie, here's what I got for you. And she opened that present, and when that coat came out, she and my mother both screamed. You got one too. I got one too. She put it on. She went dancing around. She went over and grabbed Uncle David around the neck and started kissing him and crying. Oh, David, how did you know I wanted this? This is the most beautiful thing you've ever gotten me in our life. Oh, thank you. Kiss, cry. You should have seen the look on his face. He looked like a fella who thought he was stepping in a little hole and it turned out to go over his head. Well, about that time, my mother decided we better go home. And we went in there to get our coats, and one of them wasn't there. She was the oldest sister, and she had negotiated the marriages of all her 6 little sisters. She knew those men very well. And it took her about 10 seconds to figure out what happened and what she was going to do about it. And she came storming out of that bedroom like she was mad as a hornet. She said, David Boyd, you've left all your windows open, you've left all your doors unlocked, and some member of the roving element, while we were having our nice Christmas dinner, has slipped in your house and they have stolen my new coat. They said, oh, no, Lucille, no. You know how we like to play tricks. Ralph and I did it. Your coat, that's what Eddie, my mother says. Eddie and I are nowhere near the same size. Look how that coat fits her. I couldn't squeeze into it if I had to. Now, as much as she loves you for getting her that coat, you quit treating her like that. And she gathered us up. With Aunt Eddie wearing her coat, we left and went home. When we walked in the house, the telephone was ringing. My mom said, I believe it worked. And she went over and answered the telephone. It was my Aunt Eddie calling. She said, Lucille, I'm calling for David. He's so upset he couldn't call. He begged me to call. He is so upset because somebody slipped in our house and stole your new coat. He thinks it's his fault, and he is so upset. He wants to know if you know any place on earth where he can get you another one. And I still remember on that Monday going with most of the family to Turner's store and watching while in 1955 my Uncle David shelled out $41 to buy my mother the red coat that fit just right. And you know, those fellas never played another trick. And the next year when my mother opened her present from my daddy, and it turned out to be what she, for the next 40 years, called her silver bullet Electrolux vacuum cleaner. She said to Daddy, how did you know to get me this? He says, simple. Eddie's already got one. Well, we've used our time. We want to go have a night's sleep because tomorrow's Sunday. And we're going to have church tomorrow. And I'm going to stand here and tell a story in church tomorrow and see if you'll stay awake. I told you that my dad had nicknames for all the preachers. And he called one of them Old Sandman, because he put everybody to sleep. So, watch him, he's grinding out the sand. See, one of the masses has already gone down over there. He's already gone. The Sandman's working on him now. So maybe the Sandman can put you to sleep tonight, and I hope we'll see you tomorrow. Go home carefully. So long.
What?
Turn it down.